Most people instinctively think that there is some kind of meaning to life. They just sort of assume that it's there. In the same way that if you ask them, why are you getting out of bed? To go to work. Why are you doing that? To make money. Why? To provide for my family. Why? To bring up my children healthily. Why? Because I want my children to be healthy. Why? What do you mean, why?
Always asking why is something that we expect children to do. When adults shoot down the question by saying, well, stop asking why, or something similar, we're actually teaching them that some things are too foundational to be questioned. But nothing is too foundational to be questioned. You should be asking why. And when you feel like you can't give a coherent answer, you should ask, why can't I? You should be re-examining your very foundations of thoughts and feelings.
For some people, they just don't recognize the question. They're just like, what are you talking about? For other people, they hear that and they go, gosh, you know what? Fair enough. I actually don't know. The nihilist is someone who sort of takes a bird's eye view of it and realizes that it's all a little bit meaningless. It is nicer to think that you are here for some kind of reason that's written into the rules of the universe than that it all is just a happy or unhappy accident.
It can be comforting to know that you're here for a purpose because it sort of takes a load off your shoulders. If there's a system in place that we're just a part of, then the bigger picture is taken care of for you. That's one less thing to worry about. But if everything was just a happy accident, then it actually is on humanity's shoulder to ensure our continued survival, our own happiness, our own justice. And that's a heavy burden and one that Republicans will happily toss over to the next generation so they can keep their heads in the sand for a few more years.
My name's Alex O'Connor. I'm the host of the Within Reason podcast. I think I'm best described as a philosophy YouTuber and former edgy atheist.
I'm still an edgy atheist.
Meaning, I think, is used synonymously with purpose. And purpose is something like reason to act or reason to be. Whenever anybody acts in any way, when I pick up a glass of water to have a drink, when I walk to a bus stop or something, there will be a reason why I've done that. These kinds of behaviors don't just spring up ex nihilo. They exist for some kind of reason. And so if you ask me why it is that I'm reaching my arm over there, it might be because I'm trying to pick up a glass of water. Why am I doing that? I don't just do that randomly. Well, because I'm thirsty. Okay, well, why am I thirsty? Well, now we're kind of into some biological science. You might say, well, it's been a while since I've last had a drink. And then you might describe what it is about my biology that causes thirst, and you might even give an evolutionary explanation for why it is that we've developed this sensitivity to thirst, and eventually this kind of has to bottom out somewhere. It will either have to bottom out in some evolutionary reason, or this contingent chain of reasoning just essentially goes back forever, or it terminates in something which is self-justifying. For the religious, it will be God. Everything they do, even if they don't cognize it all the time, will be for the glory of God. And if you're a secular person, it will likely be something else. For some people, their meaning in life might be the raising of their children. And for most people, it probably is relational. And when people say that they found their meaning in life, I think a lot of the time they found that self-justifying principle.
It's not that those things are self-justifying, it's that they don't require any justification to begin with. So if somebody asks me, why do you want to keep living? It's like, well, there is an evolutionary component, but why do I want that personally? It just is how it is. There might be an explanation for how that came to be, but when you ask why, you're kind of asking for a purpose. And so when you ask to justify something, you're asking for the purpose of something. There might be an evolutionary purpose, and that's that's going to be self-justifying in the sense that this is how it came to be. But if you ask me to actually justify it, okay, give me like a moral reasoning breakdown for why this is actually true, any system that I use to derive that is going to be self-justifying in the end. And the reason it's going to be self-justifying is because there's no real reason for me to want to keep on living, right? There's no objective reason for that. It's always going to be a subjective reason. And so if you try to justify something that's subjective, you're going to end up self-justifying it anyway. And so it's much better to say that something that's subjective doesn't require justification over saying that it's self-justifying. That's like saying I like vanilla over chocolate, and then someone asks me to justify that. There's no reason to justify. I don't need to justify that.
The thing that the nihilist recognizes is that the values he or she holds are not grounded in anything other than their own preferences or aesthetic preferences. Nihilism comes in many forms, and depending on the context, can mean many different things. But most broadly, it's the lack of belief in or belief that there is no such thing as an objective purpose to life or to the actions that we commit and the behaviors that we portray within life.
This definition is perfectly fine. I like that definition. A lot of people will associate nihilism with negativity, negative things like, oh, I don't want to do anything because there's no purpose to anything. I hate everything because there's no reason to like. These are all kind of just biased interpretations of nihilism, usually from a religious viewpoint. You can be a perfectly happy nihilist, like me.
A lot of people think that if you lived like a nihilist, you'd sort of rot away in bed. Some nihilists may do that, and I think there is actually a strong correlation between philosophical nihilism and practical depression. However, nihilism...
There might be. I'm not sure if that correlation equals causation, but I could believe that there's a correlation.
is not about the actual consequences or the things that you're doing. It's about the purpose behind them. It's about the meaning behind them. And so, suppose that you're feeling thirsty. I could explain to you that the only reason you're feeling thirst is because of some animalistic drive that you had no control over. But you're still thirsty. You still have that desire. You still have...
Right, you don't will what you will, so you're still going to have that desire no matter what the explanation is for why that desire came to be. That's exactly why I say it doesn't need to be self-justifying. It doesn't need justification. You can't control how you feel because that came from an evolutionary and biological world. And understanding that doesn't make you change those primal instincts, right? You still want to survive, you still want to drink water so you can keep surviving, and the need can be so strong that it overwhelms you to the point where I would say you might even lose your free will if these desires are so strong. If you are so thirsty and there's a cup of water right there, you might do something horrific to get that cup of water, almost against all of your free will.
Have that value of quenching your thirst, and so you'll still do that. And the same applies in all areas of life. Art and music and poetry, but also including relationships, friendships, that kind of stuff. You're still going to want to do those things. It's like Camus famously described in the myth of Sisyphus, this person who suddenly recognizes the structure of their day, waking up, having breakfast, getting in the car, going to work, taking a break, work, going back home, eating some food, going to sleep, starting again. And you sort of start to notice that you're doing this. And it's not anything about what you're doing. It's realizing, taking a step back and realizing that there's no meaning to any of this. There's nothing more than just my doing it. It doesn't go any deeper than that. One of the still greatest expositions of nihilism that can be found in the printed word is the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes takes us through the reflections of this man, this anonymous author. Some have tried to identify him, but it doesn't really matter who it is. We know that he was a great man, a king. He lived an illustrious life, but he saw no meaning in it. And he keeps coming back to this word, hevel, which means literally something like wind. And so it's translated as vanity by the King James. Vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. Meaningless. Everything is meaningless is one translation. Absurd. Everything is absurd is my favorite. He's like, I denied my eyes no pleasure that they saw. If I wanted something, I took it. I drank wine, I partied, I lived life. But in the end, I saw that it was all hevel. It was all just wind. It's just nothing. It just happens, and then it's gone. And it doesn't mean anything. But the most interesting thing is that it seems to suggest that everything that this guy was saying was true. That it is all just wind, but that somehow, by just fearing God and keeping his commandments, you have somehow solved the problem. I don't think that that's a very satisfying solution.
Not only is it not a satisfying solution, it's not a solution. Even when somebody like Ben Shapiro is faced with questions like this, he won't say that, oh, because there's God, there means that there's this logical solution that I can now point to. Instead, they say, because there's God, there's actually an infinite whole of magic and mystery that I can allude to for why there exists a solution. Not that I actually know what the solution is. And this is basically just running away from the question, tossing the question into mystery instead of actually facing it.
But then I think that that is the great theme of nihilistic literature. People try for a kind of solution, but ultimately, for me at least, they seem relatively unsatisfying. Fast forward thousands of years and you get Albert Camus' myth of Sisyphus, which famously ends with this idea of imagining Sisyphus happy. In fact, Camus is celebrated for the starkness of the opening line of the myth of Sisyphus, that there is one serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. Because everything else, how many dimensions there are to space, whether abstract numbers exist, all of that is secondary. The most foundational question is whether or not you're going to, as he once put it, have a cup of coffee or kill yourself today. You look at the seeming arbitrariness of the world around us.
There's an issue with that philosophical viewpoint, which is saying the biggest question is, are you going to actually live your life or are you going to end it? And that points more to that person's state of mind more than how important that is in philosophy. Like, I would agree that philosophically that is probably a really big question. But let's say then you decide, you know what, I'll keep living. You could ask why. Why do you want to keep living? It's like, okay, well, we could go down that philosophical rabbit hole. But once I've made that decision, now there's so many more philosophical questions, right? Even the question of why are you going to keep on living? That's another philosophical question, right? So there's so many important philosophical questions to go down. Even if you say, okay, I'll kill myself. Well, even more philosophical questions pop up from that. So it feels more like a feeling-based question more than like, this is like the most important question in philosophy.
The way that the environment
and I think that's probably also why nihilism gets a bad name, because somebody like that comes along, he's like, there's no meaning in anything. So, do I keep on living or do I just end it all now? That's the biggest question in the world. Like, it's not. It really isn't.
And the organisms within it seem to just sort of almost randomly evolve according to literal just battles for survival. I think people want something a little bit more than that. They want something which feels worthwhile, that's somehow sort of justified by some universal principle. There's almost like a moral element, that it's a good thing to be alive, that it's a good thing to live a meaningful life. And that kind of thing I think is very difficult to ground objectively. In fact, if somebody ever asks me how I might console myself in the face of these existential woes, genuinely, at least personally, it is in agnosticism. It's in the fact that I do not know the first thing about why any of this exists. Of course
Well, yeah, the issue here is that the problem itself is that there is no ultimate purpose and no objective way to say that living a fulfilling life is a good thing. People tend to be very unsatisfied with that, and I don't know, maybe it's because of my arrogance. I don't find it any more satisfying to say that living a worthwhile life is objectively good versus subjectively good for me. Good because I want it to be that way. If I want it, that's good enough for me, and this ties back to what he called justifying, self-justifying reasons. This isn't a self-justifying reason, it requires no justification. At the deepest level, wants require no justification. You're thirsty, you want to drink, you explain it via evolution giving you this desire or that desire, and it's instilled in you to ensure your continued survival. Why? You can always ask why, and that itself proves that not everything can be justified because you can always just ask for more justification. And if you want, you can have an objective reason for existing, like evolution putting us here and guiding us towards survival, and you can trace back any desire you have to the universe and the physics simply playing out the way that they did to give you your biology and your desires. But that's not justification, and it doesn't tell you if those desires are objectively right or wrong, good or bad. Those are questions you find the answer to yourself, whether or not you see living as being good and dying as bad. Those are things you have to find out for yourself. And trying to justify the subjective is like trying to figure out the texture of feelings. It just doesn't make sense, but humans are drawn to trying to make these nonsensical connections.
Why any of this exists? Of course I don't, And sometimes people ask me in a context on a podcast or on a stage or something, implicitly as if I'm going to have some answer, as if I've worked it out and I'm going to be able to communicate that to people. And I'm interested in philosophy, so I might have read something that helps to elucidate a concept, or I might be able to put a word on something that you've been thinking but didn't know was, also thought by other people. But we're doing the same thing here. And ultimately, I have absolutely no idea what the ultimate answer.
Yeah, because there are no ultimate answers to subjective questions. That's a fact to be accepted, that you have to have your own answers in those areas. For example, a murderer. We would look differently at one murderer who has philosophically thought out their worldview and is consistent versus a murderer who is hypocritical, murders for enjoyment, and then, begs for their own life when they're caught. Because one person was running on conviction and has some logic that can at least be analyzed, even if we don't agree with them, versus the other person who gave into their whims without higher thought, hypocritical and self-serving to their feelings over higher logic. Is there an objective basis for differentiating between these two people morally? Maybe, not really. They're both murderers in the end, but subjectively, one has done more philosophical legwork to get to where they are, which can be respectable. But in the end, you can't question either of these people and ask them how to justify their bloodlust any more than you can ask somebody to justify their thirst for water. But since all humans generally want the same thing to survive and live out their lives as we see fit and in peace, people who fall outside of these expectations aren't going to fit well and may end up in prison, right, for the benefit of the rest of society.
And so that kind of consoles me. And I suppose I'm just not convicted of nihilism.
It's not a death sentence, that's for sure.